The disappearance of 300 women. Deep in the forgotten wilderness of Maine, where fog clings to pine trees like the breath of lost souls, there once stood a sanctuary that promised spiritual healing to troubled women. For over 30 years, it operated in near total isolation, surrounded by nothing but dense forest and the silence of snow-covered earth. Known formally as the Convent of Eternal Tears, the institution welcomed nearly 600 women seeking refuge, redemption, or simply a place to disappear. Yet fewer than half of them were ever seen again. Of those who did return, many came back as mere echoes of themselves, quiet, compliant, and devoid of any spark that once defined their identities. Some could no longer remember their own names or recognize the faces of loved ones. Others smiled blankly when asked where they had been, as if that chapter of their life had been surgically removed from their memory. For more than a century, this chilling story remained buried in the Maine State Archives, sealed away under strict orders. It wasn't until a single testimony from a lone survivor emerged that the walls surrounding this secret finally began to crack. The account was so disturbing, so grotesque in its detail, that officials reportedly refused to release it to the public, fearing the social and moral implications would tear at the very fabric of American religious heritage. What made this story uniquely horrifying wasn't any overt act of religious fanaticism or suggestion of demonic possession. No, the true terror was colder, more calculated, and far more human, a systematic pursuit of knowledge conducted without regard for suffering, identity, or life itself. The facade had always been one of Christian charity. The Ashford sisters, as they were called, projected the image of 3 pious Anglican nuns who had fled persecution in Europe and come to the rugged frontier to serve the lost and the broken. But what they truly built in the shadow of the pines was not a house of God, but a house of horrors, a place where science and cruelty merged into something darker than either could be alone. Behind the convent's thick stone walls and fortress-like design lay an experimental facility, one whose primary subject was the feminine mind. Their goal? Nothing less than the complete reprogramming of personality, memory, and behavior through methods so extreme and ethically bankrupt that they would shock even the most hardened medical professionals today. What follows is the unsealed chronicle of one of America's darkest hidden crimes, an operation that flourished for over 2 decades under the cloak of religion, aided by respected doctors, overlooked by cautious authorities, and ultimately silenced by the very communities it preyed upon. This is not just the story of the Ashford sisters. It is the story of every woman who walked through those doors, believing she would find salvation, and instead lost everything that made her human. The arrival of the Ashford sisters. The morning of October 12, 1798 arrived in Millbridge, Maine, under a canopy of overcast skies and winds that swept in from the Atlantic with a chill sharp enough to cut through wool. Most of the townspeople had gathered near the central trading post that day, drawn not by celebration or festival, but by the slow approach of a horse-drawn wagon laden with mysterious cargo. Its wheels creaked with age and burden, and the horses, 2 powerful black Percherons, snorted as if sensing the unease of their arrival. The wagon was draped in canvas and lined with crates marked not with names, but with symbols, crosses, medical emblems, and strange notations in Latin that few in the village could decipher. It was the arrival of the Ashford women, and with them the slow unfolding of a nightmare that would take years to fully reveal itself. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford was the first to descend from the wagon. She appeared to be in her early 40s, though her bearing gave her an air of timelessness. Her silver-streaked auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath her wimple, and her eyes, gray as slate, seemed to measure every soul they passed. She moved with the confident precision of European nobility, and her accent refined and unmistakably upper-class English only reinforced the aura of authority she exuded. The townsfolk, mostly fishermen, lumberers, and their families, watched in silence as she approached the innkeeper with a request for lodging. But this was no ordinary visitor. She spoke as though she already owned the land on which she stood. Following her was Sister Prudence Ashford, a tall, angular woman whose pallid complexion and sunken cheeks gave her an almost spectral quality. Her movements were precise like those of a skilled artisan, and her hands, long-fingered and unnaturally steady, would later become tools of transformation and terror. She spoke rarely, and only when necessary, her Scottish accent clipped and cold. Even seasoned hunters and seamen confessed privately that they felt deeply unsettled in her presence, though they could not explain why. The final figure to step down from the carriage was Novice Temperance Ashford, the youngest of the trio, and by far the most unnerving. Barely past her 20th year, Temperance possessed a beauty that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. Her raven-black hair framed a face of porcelain stillness, and her deep-set eyes, dark and unreadable, gave the impression of staring through people rather than at them. Children instinctively turned away when she passed, clinging closer to their mothers, who themselves felt a shiver of something unplaceable when caught in her gaze. Temperance rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft, melodic, and utterly devoid of warmth. Claiming to be Anglican nuns, fleeing religious persecution in England, the Ashford women brought with them letters of recommendation, sealed with prestigious crests from Church of England officials. These documents, which would later be revealed as forgeries crafted with extraordinary skill, convinced the local Protestant population that the women were agents of God sent to bring refinement and order to their rustic frontier. Their generosity, too, was compelling gold coins that never seemed to run out promises of employment and open gestures of goodwill toward the community. Few questioned how 3 women could afford to buy nearly 200 acres of prime woodland. Fewer still cared so long as the sisters kept paying wages and avoided interfering with local traditions. Within a week, they had acquired the land. Within a month, they had the loyalty of local leaders, and within the year, they had built a house not of worship, but of secrets, its foundation laid in stone, its purpose cloaked in sanctity, and its legacy written in the blood of women who would never return. Construction of a fortress, disguised as a convent. Once the Ashford sisters secured their land, deed construction began at a pace that stunned the townsfolk of Millbridge. Almost overnight, teams of laborers, carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, and draymen were hired from the surrounding region, paid handsomely in gold that none dared question. For 8 relentless months, under the ever-watchful eyes of the sisters, a structure unlike anything the workers had seen slowly rose from the forest floor. At first, the townspeople believed it to be a typical religious retreat, a large convent perhaps, with enough room to house women of faith and prayer. But as the building took shape, it became clear that whatever purpose this house served, it was not a conventional house of God. The building was 3 stories tall, constructed entirely from gray stone quarried from the nearby coastline. The walls were thick, almost fortress-like, more fitting for a prison or military stronghold than a convent. The windows were narrow slits set unusually high along the walls, far beyond the reach of any outsider's gaze. These apertures offered no view of the interior and barely admitted light. From the outside, the structure appeared severe and impersonal, almost monolithic, like a mausoleum designed for the living. Most unsettling of all was the basement. Workers were instructed to dig deep, far deeper than necessary, for storage or food cellars. The excavation required reinforced supports and sophisticated drainage systems that confused even the most seasoned builders. For what purpose? One foreman asked. Mother Superior Agatha, in her serene and commanding tone, explained that the foundation must offer complete silence and solitude. Penitence, she said, requires one to be stripped of all distraction. To commune with the divine in darkness and stillness is to be reborn. Some nodded respectfully, but others whispered suspicions to one another when backs were turned. The sisters had exacting demands: steel-reinforced doors with complex locks, soundproof walls, and a ventilation system that bore more resemblance to hospital infrastructure than anything religious. Several older laborers noted similarities between these designs and what they'd seen in asylums or surgical wards during their travels. But few questioned directly. The pay was generous, the sisters courteous, and besides, it wasn't their place to challenge God's work, or so they were told. The Ashford sisters micromanaged every detail of the build. Sister Prudence often walked the scaffolding, inspecting stone placement and mortar thickness. Temperance sketched diagrams in a leather-bound notebook, occasionally pointing to areas where airflow or insulation needed adjusting. Agatha orchestrated everything like a conductor of a dark symphony, balancing charm and pressure in equal measure. To skeptical townspeople, she offered religious rationales. Spiritual healing required privacy, intense prayer required silence, and the emotionally disturbed required protection from themselves. To the laborers, she hinted at European standards far more advanced than anything in the American wilderness. Our sisters in England, she said, have found these architectural choices to be the most effective for true transformation. By the time the structure was complete, the building stood as both marvel and warning. The few locals who entered the main hall noted the coldness of the space, not in temperature, but in spirit. There were crucifixes, to be sure, and stained glass. Depictions of angels, but they lacked warmth, and the colors seemed muted, almost drained of life. It wasn't God they felt inside that place. It was control, precision, and an eerie, suffocating stillness that seemed to watch rather than welcome. Unbeknownst to them, the Ashford sisters had succeeded in constructing something truly rare in early America, a facility built not for worship or shelter, but for experimentation. A place where souls were not saved, but studied, and a fortress strong enough to ensure that no screams ever reached the outside world. The women who were sent there. The women who arrived at the Convent of Eternal Tears came from all walks of life, yet they shared a common thread. Each had in some way defied the rigid expectations imposed on women by early 19th century society. Some were daughters who had dared to reject arranged marriages. Others were wives accused of disobedience or melancholy. A few had shown too much interest in literature, politics, or religious movements that deviated from their family's chosen denomination. In a world that defined femininity by submission, silence, and domesticity, any deviation from the mold was cause for alarm. and the Ashford sisters offered a discreet solution to families desperate to preserve their social standing. Unmarried mothers were a frequent subject of scandal in those days, and the convent's doors opened wide to receive them. The sisters promised not just forgiveness, but transformation. Their promotional pamphlets, subtly distributed by word of mouth and whispered recommendations, spoke of miraculous recoveries from hysteria, melancholy rebellion, and moral confusion. It wasn't cheap. A month's stay cost $20 silver, 3 months cost $50. A full 6-month complete reformation cost a staggering $100, a sum that would bankrupt most working-class families. Yet the demand only grew. Families from as far as Boston and Portsmouth sent their troubled women to the Ashfords. Wealthy merchants, prominent judges, even clergy found the sisters' methods both effective and convenient. No courts, no scandal, no press. Just a quiet retreat into the forest, and months later, her daughter returned docile and obedient, her fire extinguished and her memory conveniently blank. The types of patients varied widely. Some had simply refused to adhere to gender norms, reading too much questioning doctrine, resisting suitors. Others suffered from genuine trauma or grief, widows unable to remarry, women mourning the loss of children, or victims of domestic abuse. Many were healthy in mind and body, yet labeled unstable simply because they refused to conform. Some were sent against their will, dragged from their homes by hired escorts. Others were coerced by family members who claimed it was for their own good. Religious tensions also played a role in shaping the convent's clientele. Puritan families sent daughters who flirted with Anglicanism. Anglican families disposed of daughters who had become enamored with the impassioned sermons of Baptist revivalists. In a divided religious landscape, the Ashford sisters marketed their brand of correction as spiritually universal. Christian discipline transcends denomination, they insisted. It was not about saving souls, it was about reshaping them. By 1802, the convent had already processed over 100 women. It was praised not only for its healing ministry, but for its ability to reform the socially inconvenient. And behind the stone walls, the sisters worked tirelessly, not as caregivers, but as scientists with a pool of live test subjects, each woman's defiance, intelligence, or emotional volatility seen not as something to be understood, but something to be corrected. What those families did not understand, or perhaps chose not to understand, was that their daughters were not returning healed. They were returning emptied. Stripped of will, curiosity, and memory, they became compliant, hollow versions of the vibrant souls who had once challenged the status quo. And for the Ashford sisters, each one was another successful case study, another milestone in their quiet war against the complexity of the feminine mind. First witness: Thomas Brewster's discovery. 1803. It was a bitter February night in 1803 when Thomas Brewster, a 20-year-old trapper, unknowingly stepped into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had been tracking a wounded deer through the dense pine forests that surrounded Millbridge, his boots crunching through crusted snow, his breath visible in the frozen air. Thomas was no stranger to the woods he'd grown up in. Them inherited his father's trade and knew every sound that echoed through the trees, the crack of an ice-laden branch, the yip of distant wolves, the moaning of wind across the bluffs. But that night, as the moon hid behind clouds and the forest held its breath, he heard something that didn't belong. From the direction of the convent came a sound that pierced the stillness like a blade, a scream shrill and unmistakably human, not of alarm, but of pure, unfiltered agony. It came in waves, cresting into guttural howls, then falling into gasping whimpers, before rising again into full-throated shrieks. Thomas froze, heart-pounding, unsure whether to run or investigate. Compelled by a mix of horror and instinct, he veered from his trail and moved cautiously toward the source. The convent loomed in the darkness like a monument to some forgotten god. From the front, it was as still and silent as the grave. No light seeped from its narrow windows, no movement stirred at its doors, but as Thomas circled to the rear, he saw a faint glow coming from below, specifically from basement windows partially obscured by snowdrifts. The closer he drew, the louder the screams became, now accompanied by the clinking of metal tools, hurried murmurs, and something that sounded disturbingly like a saw at work. With his back pressed against the cold stone wall, Thomas wiped the frost from one narrow window and peered inside. What he saw would forever etch itself into his mind. A woman restrained to a wooden table, her head immobilized by an iron apparatus. Her hair had been partially shaved, revealing a scalp marked with ink lines, and worse, a gaping hole through which the pale shimmer of bone and the glistening dark of brain tissue were exposed. Sister Prudence stood over the patient with terrifying focus, manipulating a slender rod with a surgeon's precision. Nearby, novice Temperance handed instruments with the calm proficiency of a trained assistant. And in the shadows, Mother Superior Agatha recorded notes in a thick, leather-bound journal, her expression devoid of emotion, as though cataloguing the results of a routine dissection. The patient, wide-eyed with terror, continued to scream as the metal instrument was inserted deeper. Then suddenly, the cries ceased. Whether from unconsciousness or death, Thomas could not tell, but the sisters continued as if nothing had changed. Their faces remained tranquil, clinical, inhumanly calm. Staggering back from the window, Thomas fled into the darkness, stumbling blindly through the snow. He did not stop until he reached the edge of town, where he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, raving with horror. His story was so detailed, so vivid, that his father, normally a skeptical and grounded man, was visibly shaken. Still, he tried to reason with his son. "You were out in the snow chasing a wounded animal, exhausted and half frozen. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure." But Thomas could describe the basement chamber perfectly, the equipment, the lighting, even the layout. His words were too specific, his terror too raw to be dismissed as hallucination. What he had witnessed was not a fever dream. It was something systematic, something methodical, something evil, erifying of all something long in and most practice. Public facade versus hidden horror. In the days following Thomas Brewster's horrific discovery, the tight-knit town of Millbridge was shaken, but not yet stirred to action. The young man's account had ignited unease in private circles, but the Ashford sisters' spotless public image posed a formidable barrier to any meaningful investigation. For 5 years, the convent had existed on the fringe of the community, cloaked in a veil of serene religiosity and unwavering decorum. The sisters made occasional appearances at church services and charitable gatherings where they spoke softly, donated generously, and carried themselves with saintly grace. Even those who found them unsettling could not deny their apparent commitment to good works. And most importantly, some of the most influential families in the region had daughters or wives currently under treatment at the convent. No one wanted to believe that something so monstrous could be occurring behind the stone walls of such a respected institution. But Deacon Morrison, the town's most trusted moral authority, could not ignore the urgency in Thomas's voice. A cautious man by nature, Morrison had built his reputation on discretion, logic, and a deep concern for the community's harmony. Still, the boy's detailed descriptions and genuine terror lingered with him, compelling him to make a discreet inquiry. The deacon arranged a visit to the convent under the pretense of discussing a fundraising collaboration for a new church roof, an event that would require the sisters' participation. Mother Superior Agatha welcomed him graciously into the convent's austere parlor. The room was Spartan but dignified, adorned with a towering wooden crucifix and somber religious paintings that seemed to observe rather than inspire. She served tea with a practiced hand and inquired about his family, her demeanor perfectly measured. When Deacon Morrison delicately broached the topic of strange noises reported by local hunters, Agatha didn't flinch. Her response, calm and theologically persuasive, framed the situation as one of spiritual warfare. Our most afflicted residents, she explained, often undergo purification rituals in the quiet hours of the night. What your townspeople may have heard were not screams of pain, but the agonized cries of demons being cast out. She spoke of women who had been corrupted by lust, rebellion, and pride, whose exorcisms required intense effort. Her words, delivered with conviction and a gentle smile, aligned perfectly with prevailing religious beliefs of the era. The deacon, a devout man himself, found the explanation disturbingly plausible. To further disarm his suspicion, Agatha offered to give him a brief tour of the convent's upper floors. She led him through clean dormitories where several women sat in silence, hands folded in prayer or gazing serenely at the floor. Their expressions were vacant, their movements unnervingly precise, as if choreographed. When Morrison attempted to engage one in conversation, she did not respond. She simply looked through him, her eyes dull and unblinking. When he asked to see the basement level, Agatha politely declined. "Those chambers are reserved for our most delicate treatments," she said. "They require strict solitude, and male presence could compromise the dignity of our patients." Within the cultural norms of the time, the response was both appropriate and unassailable. Still, as the deacon left the convent, an unshakable sense of unease trailed him like a shadow. He could not pinpoint the source. Perhaps it was the unnatural silence of the women or the antiseptic smell that hung in the air, like a memory of blood, but something was wrong. Deeply, undeniably wrong. And as he rode home through the darkened woods, he found himself wondering, what if Thomas hadn't been delirious after all? What if he had seen something real, something too monstrous for polite society to even name? The pattern of altered women. As the months passed, whispers grew louder in Millbridge and its neighboring towns. Though the convent remained outwardly unblemished, the women who returned from its treatments began to unsettle even their own families. At first, these families were relieved, thrilled even. The rebellious daughters had become obedient. The melancholic wives were suddenly cheerful. The unruly, defiant women had transformed into soft-spoken portraits of virtue. But beneath the surface of these apparent miracles, something was clearly wrong. Mary Prescott had once been the spark of Millbridge, a young woman of 19 with a quick wit, fierce independence, and a refusal to accept any of the 3 marriage proposals thrust upon her by the town's eligible bachelors. Her laughter was infectious, her arguments unapologetic, and her presence disruptive in all the ways that early 19th century society considered dangerous. Her parents, embarrassed by her boldness, sent her to the Convent of Eternal Tears for 6 months of spiritual reform. When she returned, they were elated at first. Gone was the fire in her voice, replaced by a flat, deferential tone. She accepted the first marriage proposal she received without question, her face blank as the terms of the union were discussed. Her parents praised the sisters for their success until they noticed that Mary no longer remembered her favorite poems, failed to recognize childhood friends, and stared at old letters as though they were written by someone else. Mary's condition was not unique. Hannah Morse committed to the convent after spiraling into depression following the death of her infant son, returned 3 months later as a woman reborn, except she had no memory of ever being a mother. Her eyes did not tear when presented with her baby's clothing. She could not recall the pain of childbirth or even the name she had chosen. To outsiders, she seemed healed, but to those who had known her before, the transformation felt more like a disappearance than a recovery. Then there was Elizabeth Thornton, a prominent merchant's wife, who had caused scandal by publicly accusing her husband of infidelity and seeking a divorce. Her family sent her to the convent in hopes of quelling the controversy. When she returned after 4 months, she was a shadow of her former self. Not only did she retract her accusations, she insisted they had never occurred. Her husband was, she claimed, a perfect man. She described her marriage as happy and uneventful, but her eyes drifted when she spoke, and she suffered from severe headaches that left her bedridden for days. She forgot the names of old friends. She became lost in familiar streets. Her handwriting changed, her speech slowed, and like Mary, Elizabeth bore thin, jagged scars beneath her hairline scars she could not explain. Despite mounting evidence of unnatural change, Dr. Hartwell, still under the sisters' influence, declared their treatments a triumph of modern science. These women, he insisted, have been cured of destructive tendencies. Their souls are finally in harmony with their purpose. But some mothers like Mary's noticed what he failed or refused to see. These were not cures, these were erasures. What returned from the convent were not healed women, but hollow vessels with the memories scrubbed clean and the personalities rewritten. And yet, even as suspicion crept through the community like a winter frost, few were willing to speak out. The shame of admitting that a daughter had been committed, the fear of social disgrace, and the sheer authority the Ashford sisters projected kept most mouths shut. It was easier to believe the illusion of miraculous healing than to confront the horrifying possibility that their loved ones had been surgically silenced, their minds reduced to compliant echoes of who they once were. Secret human experiments and medical network. Behind the facade of religious discipline and feminine reform, the Convent of Eternal Tears was in fact a fully operational research facility, one that engaged in secretive, methodical, and deeply unethical human experimentation. What had begun as a quiet refuge soon evolved into something far more sinister. A laboratory where minds were dissected, memories erased, and personalities rewritten, all in the name of science, masquerading as salvation. The Ashford sisters, once presumed to be pious nuns, operated as medical pioneers in a brutal, unauthorized frontier of neurological manipulation, unchecked by law, shielded by theology, and fed by the silence of a society eager to forget its inconvenient women. Evidence later revealed that the sisters had developed a chillingly precise understanding of cranial anatomy. Sister Prudence, in particular, had become adept at what she euphemistically called targeted cranial intervention. Her surgical procedures went far beyond contemporary medical knowledge, focusing not just on treating mental illness, but on altering specific regions of the brain to suppress behavior, eliminate emotion, or erase memory entirely. Using long metal probes, bone drills, and sedatives like laudanum, the sisters performed what were in effect primitive lobotomies, but with goals more ambitious than merely calming the unwell. Their objective was total behavioral reprogramming. Each patient was catalogued like a specimen. Records found decades later in hidden archives contained meticulous notes, psychological profiles, skull measurements, surgical diagrams, and post-operative observations. These documents, scientific in language, monstrous in implication, revealed a systematic approach to mind control. The Ashfords weren't simply experimenting for the sake of discovery. They were building a methodology for reshaping the female psyche itself. As their experiments advanced, the sisters sought access to more resources. They established a thriving network of communication with prominent European medical institutions. Through letters encoded in Latin and sent via trusted couriers and bribed postal workers, they exchanged data with researchers in Vienna, Berlin, and Edinburgh universities that would later claim ignorance of the true source of their information. In these letters, the sisters detailed their surgical procedures, chemical compounds used for sedation and suppression, and results of various conditioning techniques. In return, they received surgical instruments, rare medical texts, and money. A lot of money. One of their most frequent and lucrative correspondents was Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna. His letters requested in clinical language step-by-step breakdowns of procedures designed to suppress intellectual curiosity, sever romantic attachment, and to foster complete compliance in female patients. He even inquired about ways to induce selective amnesia, essentially asking for the recipe to create a woman who remembered only what she was told to remember. For such knowledge, he paid handsomely thousands of Austrian florins sent through back channels to American banks under false names. Meanwhile, back in Millbridge, the sisters' methods grew bolder. They began experimenting with chemical augmentation, administering controlled doses of opiates, mercury compounds, and early psychotropics to heighten patients' suggestibility and blur the lines between pain and obedience. Novice Temperance oversaw the psychological conditioning process, employing sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, and reward-punishment cycles to reinforce the surgical changes. She developed a regimented system that included isolation chambers, meal withholding exposure to extreme temperatures, and prolonged verbal assault designed to erode the subject's self-concept. It was all recorded. Every altered personality, every erased memory, every crushed rebellion, meticulously documented, categorized, and eventually exported. What was perhaps most horrifying was how clinical it all was. There were no theatrics, no blood-stained torture chambers lit by firelight. Just quiet, orderly procedures in sterile stone rooms conducted by women in habits, speaking softly, slicing into the minds of those entrusted to their care. and the world paid for their findings. Escalation. Accepting experimental volunteers. As the Ashford sisters refined their techniques and their reputation among underground medical circles grew, so too did their appetite for more flexible test subjects, women whose existence would not provoke questions or spark concern should they vanish without a trace. While their earlier work focused on women from respectable families sent to the convent under the illusion of moral reform, the sisters soon realized that the constraints of social scrutiny limited the scope of their experimentation. What they needed were women with no names, no families, and no one to come looking for them. And so by the second decade of the 1800s, the Convent of Eternal Tears began quietly accepting a new class of subject, the dispossessed. These so-called volunteers were often vagrants, widows, prostitutes, or women recently released from debtors' prisons. Many had been orphaned by war. Others had fled abusive homes or brothels. Some were simply mentally ill and had slipped through the cracks of an indifferent society. To these women the convent offered sanctuary, food, shelter, clothing, and the promise of medical treatment for their afflictions. In truth, they were being funneled into a nightmare more harrowing than the lives they had fled. The sisters kept immaculate records. Each volunteer underwent a detailed intake process that included psychological assessments, physical examinations, and neurological mapping. Skull measurements were taken with metal calipers, inked outlines of cranial plates were drawn, and behavioral tendencies were logged with chilling detachment. Many of these women were illiterate or cognitively impaired, unable to consent in any meaningful way, though consent was never truly sought. The experiments escalated in boldness and cruelty. These subjects became the canvas for the most extreme surgical interventions, brain tissue removal, chemical injections directly into neural pathways, and experimental procedures to manipulate emotional regulation. Some women were subjected to staged trauma, separation, starvation, extreme isolation, to study its effects on brain chemistry and psychological resilience. The sisters recorded the outcomes with the same cold objectivity as any scientist in a laboratory. Each entry in their journals read like a research paper, complete with observations, variables, and conclusions. Novice Temperance took particular interest in these experimental patients, using them to test her theories on obedience and personality reconstruction. She created a system of rewards and punishments so meticulously designed that some women began responding to commands in ways eerily similar to conditioned animals. Eye contact, vocal tone, and even posture could be manipulated with specific triggers, results that the sisters noted were far more effective when combined with surgical intervention. The documentation, later recovered from the convent's sealed archives, revealed a comprehensive database of findings, skull dimensions correlated with behavioral changes, reaction times, post-surgery, resistance thresholds under duress, and even attempts at artificially inducing religious fervor or guilt as behavioral control mechanisms. And perhaps most chillingly, the sisters began selling this data. A black market formed not of body parts, but of human behavioral data. The Ashfords became primary suppliers for physicians and researchers across Europe and North America, who wanted the results of human experimentation but dared not conduct it themselves. Through intermediaries, the convent shipped detailed reports, anatomical illustrations, and preserved specimens of brain tissue to laboratories in Vienna, Paris, and Edinburgh. Medical schools unknowingly built their surgical programs on the backs of this gruesome trade. To the public, the convent still shone as a distant symbol of piety and reform. But in truth, it had become a factory of forgotten women, those no one would miss, those the world had cast aside, repurposed into the fuel of medical progress. The Ashford sisters were no longer just secretive healers or rogue doctors. They were industrialists of suffering, manufacturing obedience and exporting it across the Western world, one scarred skull at a time. Commissions and customized mind control. By the early 1810s, the Ashford sisters had shifted from exploratory research into something far more commercially sophisticated and morally reprehensible. No longer content with merely studying the mind's fragility, they began tailoring their procedures to meet the specific demands of wealthy families across the eastern seaboard. The convent was no longer simply a place for spiritual reform or even raw experimentation. It had become a custom-order facility for behavioral engineering. For the right price, families could commission the precise transformation of a woman's mind, personality, or memory. The requests were chilling in their specificity. One prominent Boston family asked that their daughter be stripped of her artistic compulsions after she refused to abandon painting and piano in favor of marriage. A Charleston patriarch demanded that his niece's excessive interest in theological debate be replaced with a quiet reverence for her husband's opinions. A Philadelphia banker, ashamed of his wife's emotional volatility, paid for a procedure that would leave her calm, detached, and permanently cheerful, even in the face of his affairs. For each request, the sisters developed what they called a corrective treatment plan. These dossiers detailed the surgical routes to specific brain regions, the sedative formulas best suited for that subject's temperament, and the reinforcement methods to follow the operation. They described with eerie precision how to mute romantic attraction, flatten emotional affect, suppress intellectual curiosity, or induce unthinking compliance. Sister Prudence expanded her surgical lexicon, developing new incisions and access points to target deeper cognitive and emotional structures. Her diagrams, later found in secret storage rooms, showed brain cross-sections annotated with labels like rebellion site, memory root family, and obedience trigger. Many of her innovations predated official neurological discoveries by over a century. But they were not made for healing. They were made for suppression. Meanwhile, Temperance refined her conditioning protocols into an art form. Using combinations of isolation, rhythmic prayer, sleep cycle distortion, and drug-induced emotional disorientation, she reshaped women into the images desired by their commissioners. Her logs included chilling entries like Subject 19, successful erasure of romantic bond to unnamed male. No residual resistance, and Subject 26, curiosity response reduced by 87% post-treatment. Compliant to instruction, ignores books unless prompted. The convent became infamous among elite circles, not in public, but through private letters and whispered recommendations. Clients were often required to sign non-disclosure agreements disguised as spiritual confidentiality covenants. In return for enormous sums, sometimes exceeding $500 per treatment, equivalent to tens of thousands. Today they were promised results few others could deliver, not healing, not therapy, but transformation. Permanent, precise, and irreversible. To facilitate this operation, the Ashfords developed tiered service levels, basic personality redirection, enhanced moral conditioning, full behavioral reconstruction, and even memory tailoring packages for those seeking to erase specific traumas, scandals, or inconvenient episodes. Though officially presented as religious reform programs, their internal ledgers used medical codes and symbols to denote surgical classifications, expected outcome scores, and material requirements. What the Ashfords had built was unprecedented, a black market clinic for designer minds. Not only were they pioneering brain surgery, psychological conditioning, and pharmaceutical control, they were also monetizing it with surgical precision, and all under the protection of religious garb and social discretion. No one questioned where the money was going. No one asked what became of the women who didn't respond well to treatment. No one dared to wonder how far the sisters would go in pursuit of perfection. But cracks were forming in the stone walls, both literal and figurative, and their carefully constructed empire of obedience was about to face the one thing they hadn't anticipated: a woman who refused to be broken. The turning point: Sarah Whitman's resistance. In March of 1818, a new arrival was delivered to the Convent of Eternal Tears, but unlike the hundreds who came before her, this young woman would not submit. Sarah Whitman was not the typical subject, neither docile nor broken, neither ashamed nor naive. At 24, she possessed a piercing intellect, an iron will, and a calm defiance that made her an anomaly in the convent's history. Her presence would mark the beginning of the end for the Ashford sisters. Sarah's sin was that she had given birth out of wedlock and refused to name the father. Her wealthy Boston family, mortified by the scandal and desperate to silence the growing whispers among their peers, had explored every option: forced marriage, adoption, even relocation to another state. But Sarah, raised on Enlightenment literature and emboldened by a progressive education, refused them all. She insisted on raising her child herself. That stance was seen not only as rebellious, but mentally unstable, a diagnosis far too convenient. Within weeks, Sarah was committed to the convent under the pretense of restorative spiritual guidance. From the moment she stepped inside, Sarah knew something was wrong. The silence of the residents, the mechanical precision of their movements, the glassy eyes that seemed devoid of soul, it all felt profoundly unnatural. Her medical knowledge, acquired through private study and access to her father's professional library, gave her the language and understanding to diagnose what others could only feel in their gut. This place was not a sanctuary. It was a site of neurological warfare. During her first week, Sarah endured a series of strange evaluations, skull measurements, behavioral questionnaires, and subtle neurological tests masquerading as spiritual assessments. The sisters, accustomed to passive obedience, were immediately unsettled by her clarity of thought and resistance to suggestion. Where other women bowed their heads, Sarah asked questions. Where others cried, she observed. Her defiance was not loud, but deliberate, and that made it dangerous. To break her spirit, the sisters intensified their conditioning. Temperance employed her full arsenal, extended solitary confinement in lightless rooms, alternating heat and cold exposure, meal withholding, and verbal degradation, masked as pious correction. For most, these techniques would create confusion, guilt, and mental fragmentation. But Sarah, instead of collapsing, used the time to memorize the convent's structure, study the sisters' routines, and track patterns in their behavior. She preserved her mind through internal recitation of texts, mental mapping, and emotional compartmentalization. Quietly, she began writing a journal on scraps of fabric and paper, using ink made from berries and soot, hiding them in the seams of her clothing. Her breakthrough came not from defiance, but opportunity. A violent thunderstorm in late March flooded the lower levels of the convent, forcing the relocation of several patients and supplies. In the chaos, oversight waned. Sarah slipped away during a shift change and descended into the basement, the forbidden underworld where she believed the truth was hidden. What she found exceeded even her darkest suspicions. Rows of surgical tables equipped with restraints. Walls lined with preserved human brain tissue in labeled glass jars. Shelves of detailed anatomical drawings mapping regions of the mind to undesirable behaviors. Filing cabinets filled with clinical documentation of every experiment performed, painstakingly written in Agatha's elegant script, and most damning of all, letters from European doctors, coldly discussing payments, specimen quality, and results, as if ordering supplies for a butcher's shop. Sarah took what she could, pages of records, sketches, names, and hid them beneath her garments. She knew she had little time. She was scheduled for intensive intervention within days. If she didn't escape, her name would be added to the rows of successes. Another blank-eyed woman shuffled back into society with scars beneath her hair and a mind no longer her own. Her plan would have to be perfect, and her courage unwavering. The Great Escape and Testimony. On a moonless night in early April 1819, as the convent settled into its routine of eerie silence and disciplined order, Sarah Whitman made her move. She had waited patiently, pretending to comply, enduring the psychological warfare that had crushed so many others. But beneath her quiet compliance burned an unrelenting will to survive and to expose everything. Her moment came during the second night of heavy flooding, when a security routine was delayed and a guard was left alone in the western stairwell. Sarah, having studied his path for days, struck with the cold precision of someone who knew failure meant annihilation. A sharp stone to the temple stunned the man long enough for her to flee into the forest barefoot and half-starved, clutching a hidden bundle of papers under her thin cloak. The Ashford sisters were alerted within the hour. What followed was no ordinary search. The sisters mobilized a manhunt of terrifying efficiency. They had long cultivated relationships with local woodsmen and hired hands, disguising them as supporters of the convent's mission. Now these men fanned out across the forest, given orders to recover a mentally unstable woman before she could hurt herself, or worse, spread lies. Sarah heard their calls echo through the trees as she stumbled over roots and brambles, driven only by instinct and memory of her grandfather's logging trail that once led toward Millbridge. The first night she slept in the hollow of a fallen tree, soaked and shivering, too afraid to light a fire. On the second, she narrowly avoided capture by diving into a ravine as torchlight passed overhead. She stayed hidden beneath a tangle of brush, while men with axes searched just feet away. The cold gnawed at her bones. Her feet were blistered, bleeding. Her mouth so dry she could barely swallow. Yet still she pressed on. By the morning of the third day, Sarah could barely stand. But fate intervened in the form of Joshua Meadows, a solitary trapper who had once traded with her father. He found her collapsed near a creek, pale, disoriented, and barely able to speak. At first he assumed she was delusional. But when she began to describe the interior layout of the convent's basement, the same basement no one outside was ever permitted to enter, he realized this was no madwoman. Her details were too specific, her fear too visceral, and the pages she had hidden under her blouse too horrifying to dismiss. Joshua gave her food and warmth and carried her, limping and half-conscious, to the sheriff's office in Millbridge. Sheriff William Hawthorne, a man not known for credulity, met Sarah's arrival with skepticism. She was filthy gaunt and wild-eyed, mumbling about brain surgeries, chemical experiments, and missing women. To many, she looked more like a lunatic than a whistleblower. But then she produced the documents, surgical logs, letters in German and Latin anatomical sketches, and most damning of all, a catalogue of over 600 women processed through the convent's programs. Sheriff Hawthorne's expression darkened as he read the details. One entry described a procedure on a woman labeled Margaret Fowler, age 19, excessive reading, intellectual defiance. The operation targeted the language and memory centers of her brain. The result: subject now displays docility, no longer engages in abstract thought. Reading comprehension suppressed. Sarah's words, once dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman, were now backed by cold, undeniable evidence. The sheriff sent urgent messages to Portland and Boston requesting federal support. He gathered a team of 15 armed men and prepared for what he thought would be a difficult arrest. He did not yet understand he was preparing to enter the ruins of a ghost ship, one whose crew had already vanished. But for Sarah, the hardest part was only just beginning. The raid and aftermath. On the morning of May 20th, 1819, Sheriff William Hawthorne led his armed men through the dense forest trail that wound its way toward the Convent of Eternal Tears. The journey was made in silence, the weight of Sarah Whitman's testimony still fresh in the minds of each man. They expected resistance, perhaps even violence. After all, if what Sarah had described was true, they were about to confront not simply a trio of criminal women, but the operators of a clandestine medical empire built on suffering. But what they found upon arrival was worse in an entirely different way. The convent was abandoned. Not a single sister remained within the walls. The gates stood open, the door locks undone, and the air inside was deathly still. It was clear the Ashford sisters had known the raid was coming. Their network of informants, likely embedded in the local post office supply lines or even law enforcement, had warned them in time. But while they had escaped, they had not taken everything. The investigators soon discovered why. Beneath the pristine chapel floors and silent dormitories lay the true heart of the convent, a subterranean labyrinth of horror. The basement, lit only by the investigators' lanterns, revealed a surgical theater so well equipped and methodically organized that several of the raiding party men who had served in war were overcome with nausea. Steel tables fitted with leather restraints, cabinets filled with hand-forged cranial tools, walls lined with anatomical drawings and surgical journals. One hidden room concealed behind a false wall held 47 preserved bodies in varying states of dissection, suspended in glass tanks filled with alcohol and chemicals. Each corpse had been tagged. Each had a name, a date, a procedure, and an outcome. The entries read like a cross between medical reports and post-mortem eulogies. Subject: Elizabeth M. Procedure to inhibit maternal memory response. Expired during Phase 2. Tissue retained for analysis. Elsewhere, shelves of glass jars contained brain samples, carefully labeled with patient numbers and brief notes. Removed segment temporal lobe. Result: memory collapse. A locked drawer revealed correspondence from universities across Europe. Vienna, Edinburgh, Berlin, thanking the Ashfords for their invaluable contributions to psychological medicine. Some letters contained payment receipts. Others included requests for future studies. Please provide additional data on memory suppression thresholds in female subjects aged 16-22. Dr. Hartwell, when confronted with the evidence of his involvement, attempted to defend his role. These women, he insisted, were already broken. Their minds were disordered. We helped them. We gave their suffering purpose. But the sheer scale of the operation, over 600 women documented with hundreds marked as expired or missing, made his words feel hollow, even to himself. Days later, while imprisoned in the Millbridge jail, he suffered a complete mental collapse. In a final confession scrawled in near illegible handwriting, he revealed the true identities of the Ashford sisters. They were not nuns. They were doctors, Agatha Brennan, Prudence Ashford, and Temperance Ashford, each expelled from medical institutions in Europe for conducting unauthorized experiments. Agatha had been banned in Scotland for trepanning procedures on women with emotional disturbances. Prudence had been expelled from the University of Edinburgh for illegally testing surgical theories on asylum inmates. Temperance, the youngest, had never officially studied medicine, but had become the most skilled psychological manipulator of them all. The sisters had fled Europe in 1797 under assumed names, fabricated church documents, and a carefully crafted narrative of religious persecution. In truth, they had come to America not to escape injustice, but to continue their work without restraint. And for over 2 decades they succeeded. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in early American history. Federal marshals, local sheriffs, bounty hunters, and even international agents joined the search. But the sisters had planned well. Shipping records revealed that they had spent months slowly transferring money and equipment out of the convent. Bank accounts in Mexico, Canada, and Europe had been opened in their names or aliases. Safe houses were scattered across the continent. They vanished without a trace. But the legacy of their work remained in the bodies, in the records, and in the irreversible scars left on the women they had altered. And the silence that followed would speak volumes. The legacy of terror and silence. In the wake of the raid, as the smoke of outrage and horror began to settle, a chilling stillness enveloped the town of Millbridge and the broader New England communities that had quietly supported the Convent of Eternal Tears. What remained was not only the evidence of a vast, calculated program of human experimentation, but also a haunting dilemma: what to do with the truth. The public exposure of the Ashford sisters' atrocities risked more than embarrassment. It threatened to tear apart the very social fabric that had for decades relied on silence and complicity to function. The families of victims, many of them among the region's wealthiest and most influential, faced a devastating choice: seek justice and endure public scandal, or bury their grief alongside their daughters' memories. Most chose silence. To admit that their wives, daughters, or sisters had undergone illegal neurosurgical alteration was to admit to their own role in delivering them into that fate. To pursue legal action was to confront not only the Ashford sisters now vanished, but their own reflection in the mirror of complicity. Thus, settlements were never sought. Lawsuits were never filed. Names were quietly omitted from public record. Many of the reformed women were married off, institutionalized, or sent away under vague pretenses. Others, still missing, were declared dead with no official cause. Grieving mothers wept in secret. Fathers who had paid for obedience drank themselves into silence, and the rest of the world moved on. The federal investigation, so vigorous in its initial phase, began to lose momentum as the political and social cost of exposure mounted. Within 6 months, it was closed. The official summary described the convent as a fraudulent medical facility operated under religious disguise and vaguely referred to irregular treatment methods. Most of the documentation recovered from the raid was sealed in state and federal archives, labeled as sensitive material inaccessible to the public for over a century. In time, the building itself was burned to the ground, not by order of the state, but by locals who wanted to erase the physical memory of what had occurred. No plaque was erected. No public acknowledgement was made. The land was eventually resold, the stones repurposed, the soil turned over as though fire could cleanse what had been done. And yet the research lived on. The records meticulously kept by the Ashford sisters, thousands of pages of data, drawings, procedure, logs, and anatomical notes had been copied, catalogued, and distributed long before the convent fell. These documents, stripped of their origin, became the foundation for early studies in behavioral neurology, psychosurgery, and conditioning theory. Universities that had once unknowingly received their correspondence now taught their findings in medical schools under new names. Procedures that had been tested in the basement of the convent became sanitized techniques in operating rooms across Europe and America decades later. Some of the most horrifying insights gained through torture: how to suppress memory, how to induce docility, how to manipulate identity, found their way into the medical establishment. Though uncredited, the Ashford sisters' work influenced a generation of physicians and researchers. What had been born in secrecy and blood now walked in daylight, rebranded as progress. And what of the survivors? Women like Sarah Whitman, who had escaped with her mind intact, bore a different kind of scar. After months of providing testimony and helping authorities identify victims and recover records, Sarah disappeared from public life. Her family, embarrassed by her very survival, distanced themselves. She relocated to California under a new name, working as a teacher and living quietly for the rest of her life. Before her death in 1863, she wrote a detailed memoir describing every horror she had witnessed. It would later become one of the most important pieces of historical evidence in understanding what truly happened within those stone walls. The Ashford sisters were never seen again, though rumors followed them. An anonymous sighting in Argentina, a private clinic in Paris, a mysterious benefactor funding neurological research in Austria. Nothing could be confirmed. And perhaps that is the final wound they left behind. Not just the bodies, the broken minds, or the stolen lives, but the chilling realization that 3 women under the guise of holiness had operated a human experimentation empire for over 2 decades, undetected, uninterrupted, and unpunished. Epilogue: uncaptured, unatoned. Despite an international manhunt involving federal marshals, bounty hunters, and European authorities, the Ashford sisters were never captured. It was as if they had vanished into the mist of the Maine wilderness, leaving behind only the monstrous echoes of their work. Investigators eventually uncovered the extent of their escape plan: multiple aliases, safe houses throughout North America and Europe, and well-funded bank accounts across Canada, Mexico, and several unnamed European cities. Over the course of 21 years, they had not only built a facility for human experimentation, but had also engineered a meticulous escape infrastructure that rivaled any criminal syndicate of the era. Shipping logs and correspondence revealed that they had been preparing for departure for months before Sarah Whitman's escape. Equipment had been quietly moved off-site. Files had been duplicated and sent to trusted collaborators abroad. Funds had been transferred in small but regular amounts to avoid suspicion. They had studied human psychology with such cruel mastery that it should have come as no surprise they had also mastered the art of disappearance. Reports surfaced over the years. In 1847, 3 elderly women matching their descriptions were spotted running a private medical retreat in Argentina, catering to wealthy European expatriates. In 1856, a French physician claimed he had consulted with a brilliant reclusive English neurologist operating under an assumed name in Paris, one whose techniques bore uncanny resemblance to the Ashford sisters' unpublished findings. But each time authorities closed in, the trail went cold. The sisters, it seemed, had anticipated everything, even the pursuit of justice. The true scope of their crimes would only be fully grasped generations later. More than 600 women had passed through the convent's gates. Of those, approximately 250 were returned to their families with altered minds, stripped of autonomy, curiosity, or memory. Another 150 were declared permanent residents, though no trace of them was ever found. The remaining 200 were discovered in the convent's chambers, preserved as study specimens or reduced to clinical data evidence not just of death, but of methodical transformation and destruction. Even more unsettling was the revelation that the sisters had not worked alone. Over time, investigators uncovered a network of collaborators, physicians like Dr. Hartwell, who had provided materials and referrals in exchange for privileged access to the results. Postal workers who had been bribed to smuggle letters and shipments. Local officials who had turned a blind eye for the sake of reputation or convenience. Their quiet complicity had allowed the sisters' operation to flourish unchecked for over 2 decades. Universities, too, had unknowingly absorbed the Ashford sisters' research into their curricula. Surgical techniques taught in medical schools in Vienna, Paris, and Edinburgh could be traced back to the diagrams recovered from the convent's basement. Concepts such as localized behavioral control, memory attenuation, and emotional flattening, once dismissed as theoretical, had been tested, refined, and proven within the convent's walls, using living women as disposable instruments. These techniques would later re-emerge under different names in mid-20th century psychiatry and military psychological operations, their dark origins quietly omitted. The Ashford case forced a painful reckoning with the foundations of modern behavioral science. It challenged the ethical legitimacy of medical knowledge built on hidden suffering. And it exposed a terrible truth that society's veneer of civility and piety can conceal acts of astonishing cruelty so long as those acts serve the interests of order, reputation, or progress. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Ashford sisters was not their escape, nor even their research, but the silence that followed. Families who could have demanded justice instead chose secrecy. Medical institutions that could have renounced the origins of their knowledge quietly filed the evidence away. And governments that could have made examples of the perpetrators chose instead to classify and forget. In the end, it was Sarah Whitman who bore the burden of remembrance. Isolated, stigmatized, and ultimately forgotten by her own blood, she carried the memories that others refused to face. Her testimony, writings, and bravery ensured the truth would not vanish entirely. But the price she paid, social exile, loneliness, and a lifetime of trauma, was a bitter testament to how dangerous it can be to speak aloud the horrors that polite society refuses to name. The Ashford sisters were never punished, but their legacy of methodical sanctioned cruelty remains a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when the pursuit of knowledge is divorced from compassion, and when power is granted to those who see people not as souls, but as specimens. Conclusion: what we choose to forget. The story of the Convent of Eternal Tears is not simply a tale of hidden horror, medical misconduct, or criminal brilliance. It is a mirror held up to society then and now, forcing us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question: how many atrocities have been allowed to flourish because they wore the right disguise? In the case of the Ashford sisters, that disguise was religion, compassion, and scientific progress. Cloaked in habits and wielding scalpels in the name of discipline, they operated for over 2 decades under the protection of silence, respectability, and a collective unwillingness to ask hard questions. What makes this history especially haunting is not just the suffering of the women who were erased, remade, or destroyed, but the complicity of the world around them. Parents sent their daughters willingly. Doctors collaborated for prestige. Universities accepted data, knowing full well it came from unknown hands under unknown conditions. No one asked why so many women returned from the convent, unrecognizable, emotionless, scarred. And those who did ask, like Thomas Brewster or Deacon Morrison, or eventually Sarah Whitman, were dismissed, doubted, or silenced. This conspiracy of silence reveals something dark at the heart of human civilization that we will often prioritize: comfort over truth, order over justice, and the illusion of morality over its inconvenient reality. The crimes of the Ashford sisters were not only committed with surgical tools, but with the permission of a society eager to forget anything that doesn't fit the narrative of virtue and control. Worse still is the legacy of their research. Stripped of context, renamed and reframed their methods, crept into legitimate science, re-emerging decades later in psychiatric wards, military programs, and behavioral studies. What had once been considered monstrous became institutional. Terms like emotional suppression, obedience conditioning, and personality modification no longer raised eyebrows when spoken in lecture halls, though they were born in blood silence in the walls of a Maine convent. And what of today? Do similar crimes still occur behind more modern facades? Prisons labeled as reform centers, clinics offering experimental treatments for those deemed inconvenient by their families or corporations, and governments conducting studies on the vulnerable protected by bureaucratic language and public indifference. The answer may lie not in what we know, but in what we refuse to look at. We may tell ourselves that stories like this are relics of the past, that we, enlightened by modern ethics and transparency, would never allow such things to happen again. But history does not disappear, it echoes. And those echoes grow louder the more we try to silence them. Sarah Whitman's journal ends with a line that has become infamous among those who study the case. They did not disappear into the darkness. The darkness was built to hold them. Her words remind us that evil does not always come with horns and fire. Sometimes it arrives with quiet smiles, glowing candles, and the promise of healing. So what do you think? Could such systematic horrors truly remain hidden for so long even now? Or is it that we still choose in the name of comfort to forget?